Hello and welcome to PostScript. I'm John Petersen from the Arlington Institute, and we're pleased to have you with us today. Here at PostScript, we feature in-depth conversations with a variety of individuals from around the world, all who are contributing in one significant way or another to this giant epical transition that's happening on the planet, heading from an older era into a new one that has significantly different characteristics than anything that we've had before. And our guest today, which we're pleased to have, is Gregg Braden. Gregg Braden is an internationally known author and speaker. He's written 11 different books, 5 of which were New York Times bestsellers. He's a nominee for the Templeton Prize, which is kind of like the Nobel Prize between science and spirituality. And he's a friend of ours here in Berkeley Springs, and we're happy to have you with us.
John,
Great.
I'm thrilled to be here today, and I'm really excited about this conversation. I'm not sure exactly where it's going. I think it's the perfect time to have this conversation about the transition in our world and where our world is going.
Yeah.
So,
great. Well, tell us a little bit about what you've been thinking about lately.
well, this is the year 2016, and March of this year marked the 30th year that I have offered this work in one form or another. 30 years ago, I was spending time with indigenous elders in many places in the world, and they told us that a time of transition was coming. They told us the world was going to change. I was an
Futurists.
They were futurists. They were the original futurists. And I was an engineer during the Cold War years, working in the defense industry. At that time, the company was called Martin Marietta Defense Systems. Now it's Lockheed Martin. With some of the most sophisticated technology and some of the most sophisticated science that we had available to us at the time. And to even imagine at that time, in the 1980s, that the world would be going through the kind of changes that we're having now, many people just said it couldn't happen.
Yeah.
They said there's just no way. So I have been, as well as you, we have been thinking about these changes, what they could mean if they were to happen back in the 80s, what they do mean to us now. And what I know is that the best minds of our time are telling us it is a fact that we're living what's being called a time of extremes. And I think that's a good term, John, because it doesn't mean only bad things are happening or even good things, but it means big changes are happening in the world. And I think for many people, the changes are happening faster than we've been prepared to accept. We don't have a good guidebook that tells us how to embrace
these paradigm shifts.
Well, how to embrace these either on a global level or a community level, or for many of us, even our own lives. So the key, and this is a long answer to your very short question, but the key for me is to embrace this change in a healthy way. We've got to think differently, perhaps more so now than we ever have. And that's why this conversation today is so important, because the way we have been conditioned to think in the last 150 years in the West is based on a scientific paradigm that is falling apart at the seams. The science is based upon false assumptions, and that's what I'd like to talk about today.
Yeah, it's interesting because, as you know, I used to give talks in the Pentagon and everything back in the 80s, and they'd say, who is this guy and what is he talking about?
You were on a list, you know
that.
Yeah,
I know. But you could see all of this converging things, and so now you're in the middle of it, and you just have no analog. You have no history. Everything you brought into the room with you is based upon a past that was different, that's structurally different. So what in the world's going on?
Well, you know, this is what I had to ask myself. And again, we didn't have a lot of support for this back in the 80s. I mean, it was a different world. The Cold War, former Soviet Union, the former United States, because it's not the same country anymore. Right. The thinking, underlying competition, conflict, war, struggle, how we share resources together, that it was all based, and in many respects still is, in a scientific paradigm that we now know is false. When we ask ourselves the most fundamental question, John, who am I as an individual? Right. Who are we collectively? Right. Many people think that is just a philosophical, esoteric question. For me, it is at the core. It's the fundamental question that must be resolved, because the way we answer the question, who are we, provides the lens through which, perceptual lens, through which we see ourselves and our relationship to the world and solve our problems. So for 150 years, that lens has been based in a story that scientists have told us that is fundamentally based in separation, competition, conflict, and new discoveries. And this is peer-reviewed science. This isn't wishful thinking or new thought, new age, things that can't be proven. Peer-reviewed science has now overturned 150 years of thinking, and they're telling us, beginning with the most fundamental essence of our existence, the origin of life. They're telling us the origin of life, it's not random, as we've been led to believe. The origin of human life is not random. That our relationship to our body is that we're deeply connected. Our relationship to the world beyond our body is that we're deeply connected. That civilization is not linear, beginning 5,000 years ago and reaching where we are today, that it is cyclic. And that nature is actually based, the fundamental rule of nature is based on what biologists call mutual aid and cooperation, not the competition and conflict that we have been led to believe. So when we begin to look at the shift that's happening in the world, and we're seeing this play out on a global scale as well as in people's personal lives, the world's changing, and people are struggling to go back to the world that no longer exists, and they're trying to do it by applying what they know based in false science.
Sure, it's familiar, it's convenient.
Sure, and that's why it's not working. The only things that are falling apart, I was just having this conversation with a friend of mine recently, the only things that are falling apart are the things that are no longer sustainable. So we're looking...
Like the government.
Government, economies, all of those things. Well, this is interesting because Charles Darwin released his book, 1859, The Origin of Species, where he talked about who we are, where we come from, and his belief was that life, nature, is based in struggle, and he saw the world through the eyes of struggle. So I was sharing this with a friend and with a live audience recently, and I had a question from the audience. It was a good question. A woman said, okay, Greg, I get it. Maybe the science isn't right, but Darwin was 150 years ago. So what? This is the 21st century. What difference does it make? And it's a really good question, because when we think about it, the foundation of our society today was put in place in the late 1800s and early 1900s when this new paradigm was being embraced very, very deeply. So is it old? Yes. Is it obsolete? Well, this is what our competition, conflict, and struggle, that's what the economy is based on. It's what our economic system is based upon. The way we share resources, food, water, energy, medicine, information, all of these things. So the good news for me, and there's a lot of good news here, is that as that paradigm crumbles, because it's no longer working, rather than struggling to try to force the genie back into the bottle and the old way of thinking, we can let that go and embrace what the best science of the 20th and now the 21st century is telling us. And the beauty of this is, John, that it parallels and comes full circle, because the science in many instances is confirming what our most ancient and cherished traditions have always told us, that we are connected, that we live in a world of cooperation, and that when we work together, we are better as people, we have better communities and a stronger world when we work together than when we fight.
Yeah. Well, you make an interesting point, because this whole notion of how you adapt to this high rate of change is essentially one of a change in perspective. Seeing yourself in a fundamental, and your relationship to the larger environment in a fundamentally different kind of way, because that drives everything. The essential characteristics of who you think you are provide the filter for interacting with the world.
Well, sure, it does. And one of the things that's so interesting to me is that even though science, and these are the real scientists. This is not what I call the pop science that you see on the 6 o'clock news or on some TV documentary. The real scientists have embraced these new discoveries, but there is a reluctance, and I can say I've actually encountered resistance in mainstream to share these new discoveries, even though they change the way we think, they help us to solve our problems. Mainstream television, mainstream documentaries, mainstream classrooms, mainstream textbooks are reluctant to share these new discoveries. And one of the most fundamental, for me, and one of the most fascinating, is when we think about ourselves and where we come from. If we embrace Darwin's idea that the origin of life is random, that human life is random, there's really nothing special. You know, it's that we are essentially an insignificant speck of dust in an insignificant place in the corner of a universe.
Yeah.
There is a thinking that comes with that in terms of honoring and respect for our bodies, for life, for one another. And when we see societies that are taught that there is something very unique about them and that they have a unique gift to bring to the world and they are deeply connected to themselves and one another and the nature around them, what scientists have found is that we don't destroy the things that we cherish. We don't damage the things that we care about. And when we look at what is happening in whether it's war or whether it's the breakdown in society, a lot of it comes back to the way we've been conditioned to think about ourselves. So I'm personally fascinated by this. So when I began looking at Darwin, so I'm a geologist, I'm a degree geologist.
Yeah, sure.
So as a geologist, I love to look at this. And I know that evolution, for example, is a fact. I've seen it in the fossil record for some plants and some animals. The best science now of the 21st century is telling us that the theory of evolution breaks down when it comes to humans. The theory cannot explain what the evidence now is showing us. Something different is happening with us. So we're talking about physical data and we're talking about genetic data, DNA. So the physical data, and this surprises a lot of people in my live audiences, but we're all conditioned to see this evolutionary family tree. We've all seen these before where the humans are at the top, the Homo sapiens, and all these other beings, Australopithecus and Lucy and Neanderthal and everything led up to us. If you look at those trees closely and you look at the legend, the lines that connect us at the top to all those other beings, they're dashed lines. And the reason they're dashed is because they are, and the legend says, these are inferred or speculative relationships.
Right.
They are believed to exist. However, after 150 years since the relationships were proposed, the best scientific minds, the best universities, the most funding, the most sophisticated equipment possible, we have yet to find the evidence to substantiate those connections.
Right.
So my academic friends say we just need to keep looking. You know, we're not looking in the right place. So here's the thing. There's a huge difference between formulating an idea, which Darwin did 150 years ago with that evolutionary tree, and trying to force every iota of data to fit into the tree. There's a difference between that and allowing the new discoveries to lead us to whatever story they're going to tell. And that's
the way science works. I mean, they get a model and then they try to shoehorn everything into the thing. A great deal, often.
They do. A good scientist will openly acknowledge that science is designed to be constantly updated as new discoveries come to light, including Darwin.
Yeah.
Darwin said himself, he said, my theory is a first step to move us away from religion and faith to describe who we are. He said, the first time we find a discovery that doesn't support my theory must fall. He said his own language. He was okay with it. It's the academics today that are not okay with it. All right, so here's where that data comes from. DNA.
Yeah.
The DNA studies now are showing us.
Now, this is a new book you're working on, right?
I am, this is part of a new book called Human by Design.
Cool.
But it doesn't mean creationism. And this is, usually we either hear about evolution or creationism, and I think there's something in between.
Yeah.
The DNA is showing us that something happened 200,000 years ago that cannot be explained through evolution as we know it today and biology as we know it today that is responsible for our existence. And Darwin couldn't possibly have known about this in his day. So can I talk to you a little bit about,
please.
do we have a few minutes to talk about this discovery? The second largest chromosome in the human body is human chromosome number 2, HCR2 is what it's called. It's 8% of the DNA in every cell in our body. And it has been a mystery as to how that chromosome formed. And what the geneticists now tell us, and some of this work was done at Los Alamos National Labs, one of the largest genetics research labs. It was published in Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences and in the Journal of Genetics. And what they're saying, and this is fascinating, I don't want to get really technical, but it's fascinating what has happened here, that human chromosome number 2 is the result of an ancient telomere to telomere fusion.
Oh, wow.
So the telomeres are the ends of
Yeah.
the DNA that protect the DNA as it goes through a cell division. So chromosome number 2 is the result of an ancient telomere to telomere fusion where 2 primate chromosomes were fused into our single human chromosome number 2. So that happens sometimes in biology, but here's where it gets really interesting. After the fusion happened, the overlapping and the redundant portions were either turned off or removed and streamlined and stabilized to give us the chromosome that we have today that gives us our humanness. Mm-hmm. So 200,000 years ago, what happened? If you look into the anthropological record, humans appeared on Earth 200,000 years ago. All of a sudden, 50% larger brain, complex language. We had the body that we have today. And the thinking has been that we evolved from these other creatures. 1987 in Northern Europe, in a cave deep in the earth, the body of a Neanderthal infant was discovered in a rare state of preservation. It's supposed to be one of our ancestors. And they were able to take the DNA from her rib. We can actually, this is like CSI stuff. Yeah. They were able to cull the DNA from her rib and compare her genome to ours. The results were published in the journal Nature, the year 2000. They say there is not enough overlap. We are not descendants from Neanderthal. We walked the earth, we shared the earth with them, so we know who we're not. We're not Neanderthal and descendants. However, Cro-Magnon is a term that used to be used for another ancient form of life that is no longer used. It's been replaced with the word anatomically modern human, AMH. AMH showed up 200,000 years ago, and we haven't changed since. They are us, we are them, we are genetically identical. We have the same cranial capacity, the same body, and there appears to be no evolutionary path leading to them. They appeared 200,000 years ago with the human chromosome number 2 fully intact as it is today. So we don't know why this happened, but we know how it happened, and it happened with the ancient fusion of this DNA that led to the modern humans that showed up 200,000 years ago and that we are today. So for me, this is fascinating because it throws a whole new light.
So where do you think they came from?
Well, this is the question. Well, here's the thing. One of the fundamental tenets of evolution is that nature gives us what we need only when we need it.
Absolutely, yeah.
And the way it's stated, Wallace stated this in the 1870s, he said, nature never overendows a species beyond the needs of every day. Well, the problem is we're all overendowed because we showed up with this advanced nervous system and the advanced brain, and this is where we're going to go with this conversation, and the extraordinary capabilities that this nervous system gives to us. It gives no other forms of life. Abilities that we have called extraordinary, I personally believe they are ordinary that we've forgotten in everyday life. But right now, mystics,
that are
yogis,
being kind of activated at this time to allow us to effectively deal with the high rates of change.
Well, this is the beauty. This is the beauty. So when you put this into the big context, here we are in a time of extremes. We've got to think and live differently than we ever have, and we are now becoming aware that there is something unique about us, that we are endowed with this advanced nervous system that allows us to commune with the world around us and self-regulate ourselves. We're talking about the ability to trigger anti-aging hormones on demand, to trigger self-healing on demand, to trigger enhanced immune systems on demand, deep intuition when we choose to have it. All of these, and we're going to talk about these in just a few moments. So all of these are available to us because of this human chromosome number 2 that no other form of life has, that we showed up with 200,000 years ago. So I think there's a beautiful symmetry to what's happening. And then you mentioned earlier, we may not have in the West a good roadmap for this change, but our ancestors told us this change was coming because it always does. Every 5,000 years or so, Earth's location in space changes, and it changes the way we live on this planet. It shifts climate, it shifts weather, it
changes
shifts
the energetics,
energetics, how we grow our food, where we grow our food, where we live. It changes the energetics of the human body. And we, under some conditions, we are more aggressive, and then some that we are more
exactly,
cooperative.
yeah.
And that now is being directly linked to magnetic fields of the earth and the sun,
Right.
all these things. So these are rhythms of nature, cycles on these huge, vast expanses of time that are beyond 1 or 2 or 300 years that scientists are typically looking at. So our ancestors tracked these. They told us the change was coming, and they have given us the opportunity, the gifts. They say, how do you deal with that change? You deal with the change in the world by embracing the potential within.
Yeah, we should talk about that in the second segment.
That's precisely where I'd like to go with
Yeah.
this. So does that make sense, what we're doing so far?
It's fascinating because what you're doing in broad kind of terms is essentially saying that we're built for this integrated, interdependent, holistic kind of relationship.
We are wired.
relationships.
We
Yeah.
are wired for this kind of change, and we are wired for deeply intuitive relationships with ourselves and with the world. And
I mean, it's interesting to just look at it from terms of technology and the internet, which is providing this interconnection and kind of almost like a global brain that facilitates the emergence of some of these ideas.
well, and the technology is a big part of it, John. It's doing that on a global level, but it's also validating the abilities on a scientific level that so many of the people, I've spent much of my adult life with indigenous people, the shamans, the monks,
Yeah,
the nuns,
right.
the abbots, the lamas, the shamans from the Andes Mountains of Bolivia and Peru and Egypt and Tibet and Nepal and all of these places. And as different as they are from one another, the common theme, they've all told us in their own way two things. They say, you are not what you've been told, and you are more than you've ever imagined. They tell us that. And can you imagine a young person being steeped in the story of their uniqueness and their great potential from the time they're young, rather than being steeped in their separateness and in the fear and in the idea of struggle from the time that they're young? You can imagine what difference that makes in the way they think of themselves
it just
in the world.
opens up possibility, extraordinary kind of possibilities.
Now, let me just give an example. One of the new discoveries now of what we are endowed with is the discovery of 40,000 specialized cells in the human heart that are called sensory neurites. So they're like brain cells, but they're not in the brain, they're in the heart. And these specialized cells, they think, they feel, they remember independently of the cells in the brain. So we have our own language in the heart. All right, we in the West, we come into this world and we're conditioned to look at the world through our brain, and if we're lucky as an adult, maybe we'll tap into our heart. If you go into traditions like the Kogi, for example, in South America, when their children are born, they keep them in relative isolation without a lot of external stimuli, so that they must first interpret the world through their heart. And when they master that, then they go into the world and they begin to learn through the brain. It's just the opposite. Now, I'm not saying one's right, wrong, good, or bad, but these different ways of embracing our potential give us a different worldview.
I think they're the folks who keep their eyes closed when they're first born, and then they learn how to see at night in the dark.
Because these cells, and this is not a metaphor.
No.
And again, we'll talk about this more in the second segment, but it's not a metaphor. These cells, they literally think and remember.
Yeah.
They have their own memories independent of the cranial brain. So the young children, the young Kogi, they learn to interpret the world through this language, and it's a very sensual language of the environment and nature, and then they begin to apply the logic of the brain. And
Well, there's a principle here, and that is that from the previous paradigm, you cannot make effective sense out of the succeeding paradigm, that it operates in such a fundamentally different kind of way. And it's really interesting to kind of work our way into this. And in the second segment that follows here, we're going to talk about what the implications are of this kind of change and what the significance is and what we can do as individuals and to be able to deal with it.
I like that.
And so thank you for being with us here on PostScript today. Our guest has been Gregg Braden, who's an internationally known author and speaker, and we're pleased to have him here with us in Berkeley Springs in wonderful West Virginia. And I'm John Petersen from the Arlington Institute, and come back and watch the second episode, please.